Hey, welcome guys to another chapter in macroeconomics. I hope you guys are doing pretty good. I hope you guys are having a good week so far. We're basically nearing the finishing line. Things are almost coming to a completion. Um and I hope you just hanging in there. It's been a rough semester for everyone. It's just unfortunate I couldn't get to see you guys. And I really apologize for that, but we just had to go online. Again, if you have any questions, if you need help with anything, please see me or just see the SI. Please don't hesitate. I really want to see you guys. Especially if you have any questions, and I just want to connect with you guys. It's just unfortunate that I couldn't connect with you guys this semester. Okay. But I'm sure I'll see majority of you or some of you probably next semester in microeconomics, and it's going to be a whole different experience. I can definitely assure you that. Okay. Today we're going to be looking at monetary policy, which is one of my favorite sort of topics in economics. One of the reasons I fell in love with economics was basically understanding monetary policy during the 2008-2009 financial recession. And chapter 14 is going to rely heavily on material from chapter 8. And remember, chapter 8 involved the money market, where we looked at money supply and money demand, and how money supply and money demand basically changes interest rates. And it's also going to be relying heavily on chapter 10, which deals with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. To be honest, this is the last chapter dealing with macroeconomics. The next chapter after chapter 14, which is going to be the last chapter of the semester, guys, you finally made it, is basically going to be dealing with international economics, right? So this is going to be the last chapter before the very last chapter of the semester. Just hang in there, and you guys are resilient. You guys almost made it. Okay. Right, again, I'll go through the learning objectives because I believe the learning objectives are really important. Okay, so the first thing we'll look at in this chapter basically is we'll describe the objectives of monetary policy, right? So why should, or what is the goal of monetary policy? Why should the Fed or the United States government basically have some objectives for monetary policy or set a goal for monetary policy, right? So last Thursday, the Federal Reserve actually decided to keep interest rates low at 0.25 percent as COVID cases rose. Okay, and the Fed basically promised to keep it that way till full employment and higher inflation levels basically arose. Okay, so what are the objectives of the U.S. monetary policy, right? Explain how the Federal Reserve makes its interest rate decision and achieves its interest rate target. Okay, so again, the Federal Reserve decides to keep interest rates at 0.25%. Why not 0.3%? Why not 0.4%? Okay, why that particular figure? Also, we'll look at the transmission mechanism for monetary policy, right? How does monetary policy through certain variables basically affect the economy, right? How does it actually influence real GDP, jobs, and inflation? Okay. And then finally, we'll describe the Fed's actions during the 2008 financial crisis and the steps it took in trying to mitigate the crisis and trying to help the United States government basically out of a recession. Okay. These are the things we'll essentially be looking at. So again, to actually understand, a chapter, I feel like you need to actually know these objectives. Once you know the objectives, you should be able to sort of like understand the chapter fully. Okay. So learning objective number 1, we'll be looking at monetary policy objectives and framework. Okay. Right. Now, the first thing we need to look at is basically when the Federal Reserve itself, which is the central bank of the United States, was basically formed. Okay. So the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913 under the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, right? And at that time, there was no national bank, and banks were basically made to do whatever they wanted to do. And there was a lot of confusion in the financial system where, bank panics usually tend to happen. Banks had their own regulations, and customers were pretty confused as to what to do, okay? So then in 1913, Congress established the Federal Reserve to oversee all financial institutions in the country and essentially to also conduct what we call monetary policy. During the early 1900s, economists began to find that monetary policy is, you could use monetary policy to actually stimulate the economy, or you could actually employ, certain financial regulations to basically help the economy out. Okay, right? So the law basically sets out the main purpose and functions of the Federal Reserve as to what the Federal Reserve should do. And Congress actually has the power to basically amend the act. Okay, the last time it was amended, I think, was in 2000. Okay, so what is the monetary policy objective? And I'm basically going to read this out. To be honest, you don't need to write this down, but I feel like it's something that you should just know. Okay, so the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, okay, remember the Open Market Committee is responsible for monetary policy, shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with long-run potential to increase production so as to promote effectively the goals of a maximum employment, prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. And I think this is what is important. Okay, so right off the bat, you can basically see the goals of the Federal Reserve, right? It's basically to maintain maximum employment, maintain stable prices, and also moderate long-term interest rates. Okay, right, so here, that was really long, and do you need to remember it again? No, I mean, come on, I don't even remember it myself. Okay, but we can simplify and basically dissect the whole sort of statements, nebula statements we have over here. Okay, right, so the next thing we need to look at is basically the Fed's monetary policies, right, goals. Okay, so the Fed's monetary policy objective has two distinct parts. Okay, first, a prescription of the means by which the Fed should pursue its goals, and a statement of the goals itself. Okay, the first goal we basically have is maximum employment. And when we say maximum employment, remember, maximum employment is in the long run the scenario where we have actual GDP, so actual real GDP, equals potential GDP. Right, again, remember, potential GDP is the maximum amount of resources, is the maximum amount of output and production a country can basically achieve if it maximizes all its resources. Okay, so it's the optimal amount of goods and services that need to be produced. Okay, right, so in the long run, the Fed should actually conduct monetary policy in order for the country to be able to meet its optimal level of production. Okay, so that is the first goal. The second goal is basically stable prices. Now imagine if you went to Walmart, right, to get your favorite gallon of milk, and it was $1 today. And tomorrow you went to Walmart and that gallon of milk, same gallon of milk, identical gallon of milk is $20. And then next week you go and it's $40. And then 2 weeks after you go it's $20. Prices are just being erratic, right? You wouldn't feel comfortable in living in such an economy or a country, okay? Right, so essentially the price level should be stable, okay? So when we say stable prices, we're looking at the price level. And we're looking at inflation. Okay, so inflation, a little bit of inflation is good, okay? Generally when there is inflation, it generally means that the economy is growing a little bit, hence an increase in prices. Okay, so a little bit of inflation is good, but it has to grow at a steady lower rate. Okay, that's an important thing. Okay, and then finally, the Fed has to moderate long-term interest rates. So you don't want interest rates to be really low. At the same time, you don't want interest rates to be really high. Imagine you're going for a car loan and interest rate is like 40%. How many people are going to buy a car in such an economy, right? You're going to buy a house and the mortgage rate is basically 90%. How many people are going to actually buy a house, really, right? So you basically need to moderate long-term interest rates, right? And the interesting thing is that basically all these things basically sort of reinforce each other. If there are stable prices in the economy, there's going to be stable production and there's going to be maximum employment as well. Also, if there's maximum employment in the economy, generally it's due to the fact that interest rates tend to be moderate and stable, And if interest rates are moderate and stable, it tends to lend itself to stable prices as well. Okay, so these goals generally reinforce each other. Now, the very key goal of the Fed, and this again depends on who the Fed chairman actually is, to be honest, okay? But a very, very important goal of the Fed is to maintain price stability, okay? Just to make sure that prices don't get erratic and we don't have a case of hyperinflation like we do have in Venezuela and we did have in Zimbabwe, okay? Now, so that is the key goal of the Federal Reserve. Now, the inflation target rate is around 2%, okay? So that is what the Federal Reserve basically hopes to maintain inflation at 2%, okay? And if it's at 2%, basically the Federal Reserve is happy, okay? Now, there are two measures of inflation the Federal Reserve basically pays attention to, and we've already seen how to calculate inflation. You guys are experts at calculating inflation. In fact, you guys are fantastic at calculating inflation, right? So remember the first one. The first one was what we call CPI. And do you remember what the CPI basically stood for? Well, the CPI, right, basically stood for Consumer Price Index, okay? So that was the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, okay? Right, and the Consumer Price Index basically looked at a fixed basket of goods and services and their average price levels, okay? Now, there's another measure of inflation which we really didn't take a look at, okay, which is basically personal consumption expenditure deflator, okay? And the personal consumption expenditure deflator, also known as the PCE deflator, is calculated from the consumption expenditure component of GDP, okay? So basically for a year, right, what people consumed, what is their average prices, okay? Right, and we have the personal consumption expenditure deflator calculated as nominal consumption expenditure divided by real consumption expenditure times 100. Okay, so when we say real consumption expenditure, this is the consumption expenditure which is basically accounted for inflation. Okay, right. And the PCE deflator basically excludes fuel and food from it because fuel and food prices tend to be highly volatile and they don't give a clear indication of the general increase in their price level, okay? So that is what we call as the core PCE deflator, okay? So the core PCE deflator excludes fuel prices such as oil prices, okay, natural gas prices, and also typically food prices such as corn prices or prices of just general food, really, right? And that is why we basically sort of exclude them because, again, like I said, they're highly volatile and they don't give a clear indication of price changes, okay? So ideally, these should be around 2%, okay? This should be around 2%, and if it's 2%, it's basically good, okay? So basically what the Fed pays attention to is what we call the core inflation rate. And the core inflation rate is basically the percentage change in the core PCE deflator. And again, this is how we find the core PCE deflator. Again, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask me, okay? Now, the Federal Reserve have what we call the comfort zone. Okay, so the comfort zone is when inflation rate is between 1% and 2%. Okay, that is the comfort zone of the Federal Reserve. Okay, right. So now let's see how core inflation has acted since 2000 to 2018 in terms of whether inflation rate is basically in the Fed's comfort zone. Okay, so we'll take a look at this graph. Okay, and clearly we can see that inflation rate, with the exception of maybe the periods from 2004 where there was heavy economic expansion to 2006, inflation rate has mainly actually been in the in the comfort zone of the Federal Reserve. Okay, inflation rate has mainly been in the comfort zone of the Federal Reserve. Okay, and it's been able to keep inflation rate at 1 to 2%. So the Federal Reserve is actually doing a good job. Okay, the current inflation rate in the United States is around 1.8%, which is basically, again, in the comfort zone, is below the target inflation rate of basically 2%. Okay, it's basically 2%. Right. So the next thing we'll look at is basically maximum employment goal. So it's not only price stability that basically sort of matters to the Fed. Okay. Essentially, business cycles matter to the Fed too. As in, if the economy is going through a heavy expansion, or if the economy is going through a heavy recession. Okay. So business cycles matter, right? After all, it's the Fed's mandate to basically maintain maximum employment. Okay. And in that sense, the Fed takes a look at what we call the output gap. And what is the output gap? Well, the output gap, remember, is basically actual GDP minus potential GDP. Right? So it's also the percentage deviation of actual GDP from potential GDP. How much does actual GDP basically deviate from potential GDP? Now, if you have a positive output gap, it means that actual GDP is greater than potential GDP. And generally, it means you actually have an inflationary gap. And when actual GDP is basically higher than potential GDP, it basically means that the country is overproducing and the economy is basically steaming up. And it generally leads to an increase in price level. Okay, everything is expanding, everything is kumbaya, people are demanding a lot of goods and services. And you know that if goods and services are being highly demanded, right, that basically leads to an increase in the price level. Okay, right, so a positive output gap means actual GDP is higher than potential GDP, also means an economic expansion or overproduction. Okay, and in that sense, it causes increase in deflation. Okay, right. And also, we have negative output gap, which basically indicates a recession and falling inflation. Okay, so that is when actual GDP is basically less than potential GDP. It means the economy is not producing its maximum output or its optimal output. It's basically lacking behind, okay? So there's a target GDP that the economy basically can't face. And it means that production levels are really low, it's underproducing. And generally, if an economy is underproducing, demand for goods and services are pretty low. It means that firms can't produce as much. They need to lay people basically off. There's unemployment and also creates a recession, okay? So the Fed basically pays attention to the output gap, and it's the Fed's goal, the Federal Reserve's goal, to basically minimize the output gap. And we'll basically look at ways in which the Federal Reserve basically minimizes the output gap, okay? So one, remember, the Fed has the goal of basically maintaining price stability, and also the Fed has the goal of minimizing the output gap. Now, what is the responsibility of government in terms of monetary policy? Okay, so what role does the Fed, the Congress, and the President of the United States plays in terms of conducting monetary policy? Okay, well, the role of the Fed is basically to conduct monetary policy. Okay, according to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, is basically stated in law that the Federal Reserve is basically supposed to conduct monetary policy. So responsibility for monetary policy basically falls solely under the Federal Reserve due to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, right? And the FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, basically is the branch of the Fed that conducts monetary policy, or is the branch of the Fed that is basically responsible for monetary policy. Okay, what about the role of Congress? Well, Congress plays no role in conducting monetary policy. Okay, so Congress basically has absolutely no role in the conducting of monetary policy. What about the role of the president? Well, the president has no role in conducting monetary policy, and it should be that way because monetary policy is supposed to be impartial or biased, okay? Right? So, basically, the only role the president has is to appoint the chair of the Federal Reserve and board of governors of the Federal Reserve, okay? That is the only role that the president has. Okay, so the role of the Fed is solely responsible for monetary policy. Congress has no role, and the president basically is just there to appoint the chair of the Federal Reserve. Okay, so I'll end this first part of the video right here. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, take care.